housing prices in Western countries are starting to crash. The experts are predicting it could be a double-digit loss. And I'm going to tell you what you can do to prepare yourself and why it's so important that you be aware of this. Fortune had a great article, and the title is "A Housing Crash in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. It Sure Looks Like It." And so the idea here is that the U.S., in many parts, will escape a larger scale housing crash, although some frothy markets like Boise and Phoenix could also be affected. But I'm going to tell you why this is so important. If it's your first time here, my name is Andrew Henderson. I'm the founder of Nomad Capitalist. We're a boutique consulting firm that helps 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors legally go where you're treated best, from reducing your taxes to building your freedom overseas to moving part of your portfolio into higher growth markets. This matters because I think for a long time, people in the Western world, especially younger people who've been buying houses, if they've been able to, have seen the markets go nowhere but up. We've gone through some of the largest bull market in your lifetime. And there are people now who think you just can't lose money. And the idea of, well, why when I go overseas to other markets that Nomad Capitalist talks about, when I can just buy a house in Canada, sit back and become a millionaire? That may work, but it's proving to not be sustainable. I'm going to share the article with you. And so if you're looking for sustainable growth, I continue to believe that markets that actually have fundamentals, markets where not everybody is taking out a mortgage that's 95% of the value, markets where people aren't just dumping money that governments could stop because the market gets too overheated, that's not going to be as good of a place to invest as a place where there's actually the fundamentals, where population growth is good, where demographics are good, people are making more money because more jobs are coming and wages are going up and innovation is happening. Just organic growth, to me, is always going to be at these frothy markets where people just think, hey, I can't lose, because now we're seeing you can lose. So Fortune says, for the first time in over a decade, residential real estate across the developed world, just as we've said, appears vulnerable to falling prices. That's what happens when central banks flip into interest rate hiking mode after an unprecedented run-up in home prices. There's been an unprecedented run-up. And again, I think that has stopped people from saying, hey, maybe I should go where I'm treated best, because it was just so easy to sit there. But when it's easy, right? Easy come, easy go, as they say. But unlike the last time around, the 2008 housing bust, the U.S. won't be the epicenter of this housing pullback. At least that's what they say at Goldman Sachs. This month, researchers at Goldman Sachs released the housing downturn, a bigger deal down, under and up north. So down under in Australia, up north in Canada. Throughout the end of 2023, the paper predicts a crash-like drop in home prices for New Zealand. We've told you about that, minus 21%. Australia, minus 18%. Canada, minus 13%. For comparison, the U.S. housing bubble saw home prices drop 27% between the 2006 peak and the 2012 bottom. And so Goldman Sachs basically has Australia, Canada, and New Zealand in the housing crash or almost crash camp. However, it's less pessimistic about other G10 countries. Through the end of 23, they predict housing prices will fall a mere 6% in France and remain practically unchanged in the UK. They actually think U.S. housing prices will rise about 2% in 2023. And there's different schools of thought. Some folks are seeing a 10 to 15% drop. There are certainly hundreds of markets where it is well known that there is going to be a drop. But the U.S. in a whole, Goldman Sachs is predicting will be up. So different opinions there. Where there aren't so much different opinions is, we've told you in New Zealand, numerous experts there are saying, yes, we are going to see big drops. Canada, the same. I was telling you over the last year, not because I'm your financial advisor giving you advice, but just saying, here's what I would do. If I was living in a high-tax country where they took my freedoms away for a couple of years, and as a result somehow of them taking freedoms away, people wanted to buy bigger houses out in rural areas, money was cheap and easy, and so people bought up all these other, people kept buying properties, foreigners were coming in. I don't entirely understand why they think there's some greater rule of law in Canada where they can't take your stuff or something. Wait a second. And so housing prices became really frothy. And I said, hey, if it were me and I were looking to go where I'm treated best, because that's what we do here, I would like to take some of this cash off the table, and I can put that into buying a fully funded property in a country where maybe I can't get a mortgage, but because mortgages are harder to come by, any growth that I will experience in that property is going to be more organic. George Gannon and I have talked about Colombia as one example. There aren't really that many mortgages in Colombia, especially compared to the Western world, and yet prices go up not only in peso terms, but in dollar terms in good neighborhoods, generally year over year. There's just more solid fundamentals there. We may see some dip in more expensive housing inventory in Colombia with talk of a new wealth tax, which, by the way, isn't even as nasty as the wealth tax they're talking about in many Western countries. But certainly at lower price points in Latin American countries, let's say under $500,000, you will probably continue to see gains just as you always have. And so if you took money out and you cashed it at the top and you can now use that money to diversify, then you did well. Otherwise, your property may go down in value. Why is Goldman Sachs' fortune continues so much more bearish on countries like Australia and New Zealand than the U.S.? It boils down to detached fundamentals. Yeah, what we've been saying here for a long time. While home prices in the U.S. are historically frothy, home prices in Canada are simply off the charts. If you realize that, and we had some clients who did, they're like, I sold out a year and a half ago. I'm just sitting on the money. In 2021 alone, Canadian home prices soared 27%. Oh, the money was so easy. What do you need these other places for? Just stay here, just relax, and the money rolls in. Oh, yeah, until it doesn't. Well, U.S. housing prices climbed a more modest 18.9%. Across the G10, home sales are falling quickly and house price growth is slowing, with outright price declines in places that saw the bigger increases during the pandemic, write Goldman Sachs researchers. That said, they also note some U.S. regional housing markets will see declines. Again, they mentioned Boise and Phoenix. A separate analysis by Moody's predicts that U.S. home prices will either remain stable or fall about 5% next year. And then they mention what we've been talking about, 187 significantly overvalued regional housing markets, Boise, Charlotte, and others. We also have told you how more than 400 U.S. housing markets, smaller markets, have never recovered from the drops they encountered in the late 2000s. And so this idea that everyone's been making money, sure, if you were in Boise, Charlotte, Phoenix, many parts of California, etc., sure, you did well. By the way, you've been paying a lot more in property taxes in the U.S. and Canada and elsewhere than you would have been paying if you're investing in places I have. I invest in places property taxes are 0, property taxes are 10 basis points. I've got one place it's $800 a year. You get basically a U.S. size home that would, if you lived in many parts of the U.S., would cost you, $10,000 a year or more in property taxes. And so there are a lot of things that along the way, when everyone's had this euphoria about housing prices, you've been paying high carrying costs. And by the way, if you're living in the United States, you may have to pay some tax on these capital gains when you sell, depending on your situation. So it was never as perfect as people thought it was, right? And we've seen this before. We saw, when I was just starting in business back in the mid-2000s, everyone was taking mortgages out, they were buying jet skis, they were having the time of their lives. And then what happened from a political point of view? When everything went into the tubes, they blamed the banks. Now, I'm not here to defend the banks, but you took the money out, you couldn't pay it back. And then what do? Oh, someone should do something about it. The government should do something about it. Let's have more taxes, let's have more regulations, let's go after these people, let's go after successful people, let's go after the 1%. Remember how that concept was born during the last housing crash? And so the 1%, is it really about the 1%? Is it really about the 55 corporations that they estimate are really paying no tax and maybe should be paying some tax? Or is it about, you seem successful, you're wearing an expensive looking sweater, you drive a nice car, you live in a nice neighborhood. Yeah, you're probably the 1%. Why aren't you paying enough? Actually, I'm paying 43%. You're not paying enough. And so not only have you perhaps lost an opportunity to cash out, take a bunch of money through this incredibly frothy housing market that we've seen in Western countries, which really didn't have, as the article says, it's not just me saying it now, not just some YouTube influencer saying it. Now it is people like Goldman Sachs saying there were no fundamentals supporting this. It was just, everything going crazy. And so I've been telling you for years, why not invest in places where you can actually have market fundamentals? Again, demographic growth, wage growth, people moving to capital cities, things moving in the right direction. What you're going to have if you stay in the West is you are going to lose the opportunity to take some of that cash out and put it places where it could be treated much better, lower taxed, better growth, more fundamentals. But if this becomes bad, people who have the majority of their net worth or all of their net worth because they don't save much money in their homes are now going to feel a lot poorer. That may hurt the domestic economy, but it's also going to hurt you because the political issues are going to be all the vulture politicians that want you to pay more tax because you run a business, because you are a successful investor. They're going to feast on this. When people feel poor, they feel desperate. You already have high inflation caused by some of the same factors. people's wages aren't keeping up. The wages weren't keeping up in the first place because the world is now open, and that's what's driving the fundamentals in some of these other markets where you can buy property that actually just continually goes up over time because people have more money to spend. And so all these factors in the Western world that are negative are going to come back to bite you. And so I look at it as two things. Number one, if I'm diversifying my portfolio, I want to have some exposure. I've told you India, Indonesia, other emerging countries have been very successful performers in my portfolio in recent years. You want to have some exposure to that. That's just my personal advice. What you also should look at doing is if you can take money out of property in a frothy real estate market, perhaps there's still an opportunity. I'm not saying some of these markets will never go back. I'm not saying the U.S. is destined for the ash heap of history, but I'm saying that it's not going to be as competitive as it once was because there's simply too many options out there. And so if I can take some money out of these frothy markets and put it somewhere, maybe I'm going to buy a home. And maybe that home is the first step towards either now or in the future, me moving somewhere else where I'm taxed more lightly, where I have more personal freedoms, where I enjoy life more. Maybe life costs less and I can keep up with inflation more. There's still an opportunity to do that. There's still plenty of folks in the Western world, maybe you're one of them, where you have hundreds of thousands, if not even over $1 million in equity. You can buy a pretty nice property in place, get a residence permit, get a golden visa, even get citizenship if you want to go to a place like Turkey or St. Kitts and Nevis. And you can live there, you can save a lot of money. And so that's what I'd be doing. But simply sitting through this and watching incredibly frothy run-ups simply go down and suffer a housing crash when you could be investing and living in other places where you're treated much better, I don't see the need for that. But it comes down to realizing that things in your country don't always go up, especially when there's not the fundamentals backing that.